Hello, everyone. This is part 1 of week 10 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist, and we're talking about the Sophist. The Sophist has a quite interesting structure. Scholars speak of a nested structure. It has a core and a frame. The beginning and the end of the Sophist are devoted to the project of defining who is the Sophist or what is sophistry. But the core of the dialogue is concerned with what we might either describe as metaphysical puzzles, or we might also say, well, in some sense, those are questions also in the philosophy of language. And it is quite contested how we should think about that core section of the text. And I want to introduce 4 options in this recording just as an invitation to think through them. And the first option is that really what is sort of the big puzzle is, in some sense, the familiar metaphysical Platonic question, what is being? And let me use this as an opportunity to introduce the work of Mary Louise Gill, who has written a lot on late Platonic dialogues. And in her 2012 book, she argues that we should read the Sophist very much sort of with a view to this remark early on in the text where it is said that, well, there is the Sophist, there's the statesman, and then there's also the philosopher. And in theory, we could have 3 dialogues, not just the Sophist and the statesman, but also one that asks, who is the philosopher, or what is philosophy? And there is no such dialogue. So Gill argues that really, in a way, whatever else we do when we read these dialogues, we should sort of ask ourselves, what would Plato like us to infer about the nature of philosophy? And she thinks what we should infer is, well, that the philosopher is concerned with being, or at least that is one of the things that she says. And, we could apply that to the core section of the Sophist and say it is so much concerned with core metaphysical questions that it is not out of place to say that it is concerned with being. The second option is one that Paolo Crivelli defends in a 2012 book, and he thinks that really what's at issue here is falsehood. Now, why would you think that? Well, the kind of jumping off point in the text that leads into this metaphysical section is, metaphysical section or metaphysics cum philosophy of language section. The jumping off point is that the Iliadic stranger and Theaetetus have defined the Sophist as someone who makes images and thereby creates illusions and falsehoods. So the Sophist is someone who generates falsehoods. Okay, so we need to understand the nature of falsehood. So that is a good reason to think that that is what is at issue. The third option, however, is to think that, really what's at issue is not being. Because why is falsehood such a puzzle to begin with? Well, the Iliadic stranger says, if the Sophist says things that are not, does that somehow mean that he is talking about not being? And when we discuss this, does this mean that we are talking about not being? But Parmenides says you cannot talk about not being and you cannot even think about it. And for the Iliadic stranger, that is an important consideration because the question is he going to move away from something that is important to Parmenides' philosophy? So that is a good reason for thinking that really what we are doing is we reassess whether we can talk about not being, think about not being, and if we give up on Parmenides' view, what is going to be the view that we hold about not being? Now, the fourth option is defended by G.E.L. Owen in a famous paper published 1970, Plato on not being. And Owen takes it that traditionally people thought that not being is the issue, and he thinks that is a mistake. He thinks that we should pay close attention to a moment in the text at 250 when the Iliadic stranger says, initially we were so confused about not being, but now that we are talking about all of these puzzles, we are equally confused about being. And so what we need is a project of joint illumination. We need to discuss, as it were, all these puzzles such that we at the same time come to get clarity about being and not being. So I want to just lay out these 4 options and remind you of the issue that I mentioned at the beginning of the recording and invite you to think about them as it were in that light. Namely, do you think that what Plato is doing here is just metaphysics as we also know it from some of his middle dialogues? Is it somehow metaphysics and philosophy of language? What is the distinctive combination of thinking about metaphysics and thinking about the language that is going on here?